Have you ever wondered what really happened behind the sliding paper doors of a samurai castle? When night fell over feudal Japan, and the flickering candlelight touched the silk screens, the code of Bushido was no longer the only rule that mattered. Because some samurai lords followed a code far darker, a code of pleasure, control, and fear. Tonight, we enter a world history tried to erase, the secret lives of the women who served the warriors of Japan's most powerful clans. This is what samurai lords did to their concubines in feudal Japan. The era was known as the Sengoku Jidai, the Age of Warring States. Japan was divided, bleeding, and restless. The land echoed with the sound of marching feet and the clash of steel. Ambitious men carved power with their swords while the common people whispered prayers to gods who no longer listened. From the ashes of fallen provinces rose the castles of the warlords, towering monuments of ambition, pride, and cruelty. Each castle was not merely a fortress. It was a kingdom within walls, a world governed by silence and fear. Behind those lacquered gates and sliding paper doors lived women whose names history never recorded. They were called mikake, concubines. Some were gifts, others were spoils of war. Their beauty was a weapon, and their existence was bound to the mood of their lord. To be chosen by a samurai was once considered an honor, but in truth it was a sentence. A life gilded in gold but chained in obedience. A woman might gaze upon the gardens, but she would never again walk beyond them. When a new concubine arrived at the castle, the servants prepared her like a vessel. Her body was bathed in rice water and her hair perfumed with camellia oil. She was dressed in layers of silk so heavy she could barely breathe. Then, escorted by candlelight, she was led through narrow corridors where the scent of incense masked the stench of fear. She would kneel before the Lord without lifting her head. If he spoke kindly, her heart trembled with hope. If he spoke nothing, terror filled the silence. For his silence could mean either pleasure or death. Inside the uku, the women's quarters, hierarchy ruled with invisible chains. At the top stood the seishitsu, the legal wife, usually from a noble clan. Beneath her were dozens of concubines, attendants, and servants. Each woman was both prisoner and rival. They smiled at one another, yet their eyes measured every gesture, every sigh. Rumors spread faster than the wind. A glance between a concubine and a guard could lead to disappearance. A whispered complaint could reach the ears of the lady of the house, and by dawn, the offender might be gone. At night, when the castle fell silent, the women waited. They waited for footsteps that might pass their door or stop before it. The chosen one would rise, trembling, and be led away. She would not know whether she was being summoned for affection or judgment. The walls did not echo screams, but everyone heard them in their hearts. To the samurai lords, these women were not companions, they were mirrors of their own power. A concubine's obedience was proof of dominance. Her fear was a symbol of victory. The Lord believed her spirit strengthened his. Through her submission, he purified his destiny. There was ritual in everything: the lighting of candles, the folding of robes, the pouring of sake. Even cruelty had formality. But behind the formality, emotions stirred. Some concubines fell into genuine devotion, blinded by the illusion of love. They wrote poems about their lords, comparing them to the moon or to cherry blossoms that never withered. Others hated in silence, counting the days until they might be free, a freedom that rarely came except through death. In those days, human worth was measured not by virtue but by lineage. A daughter of a fallen samurai might be sold to repay her family's debts. Once inside the castle, her name was replaced with a title or number. She became the second moon, or the plum blossom. Her past ceased to exist. There are stories told of women who tried to escape. One climbed over the stone wall during a storm, hoping the rain would hide her steps. She was caught before sunrise. The next morning, the servants found a red stain in the courtyard but no body. The Lord ordered the stones scrubbed until no trace remained. That was the lesson: even in death, the concubine must not stain the honor of her master. Yet, amid this darkness, there were moments of strange beauty. The concubines painted fans with secret symbols. They sang quietly to themselves, songs of home they were forbidden to remember. They cared for one another in small, hidden acts of kindness: a comb left on a pillow, a word of comfort whispered through the paper screens. These small rebellions were their only form of freedom. And in the grand halls, the samurai lords sat surrounded by poetry, calligraphy, and art. They admired beauty while destroying it. They quoted Zen wisdom while inflicting silent torment. They believed that to conquer the flesh was to conquer the soul. In time, even the lords themselves became prisoners of their own power. Paranoia consumed them. They trusted no one, not even the women who smiled and bowed before them. Some kept diaries of every conversation, every glance. Others turned to mystics, seeking charms to protect them from betrayal. Thus the castle became a temple of suspicion, a place where every shadow had meaning, and every silence carried fear. That was the reality of the samurai's world, an empire of ritual, built upon suffering. In the great hall of the Lord, a feast was held once a month. Musicians played the shamisen, their strings echoing like a heartbeat. The concubines appeared dressed in vibrant kimonos, their faces pale under the glow of lanterns. They poured sake for their lord, kneeling gracefully, never meeting his eyes. Laughter filled the air, but none of it was joy. The lord drank and recited poems of conquest. He boasted of battles, of enemies slain, of loyalty won through fear. Each word was heavy with pride, each sip a reminder that he was both god and executioner in his realm. Sometimes he asked a concubine to sing. Her voice trembled, her song a melody of obedience. Sometimes he asked one to dance. Her movements were delicate, yet behind the grace lay exhaustion. When the night grew late, he would dismiss the others with a wave of his hand. The chosen one remained. From the servants' quarters, they listened. The faint sound of sliding doors, the murmur of voices, then silence. No one spoke of what happened after the feast. But they all knew. Among those who served was a young maid named Chio. She had come to the castle as a child, too poor to refuse the offer. Her job was to clean the lord's chambers after the nights of pleasure. She never looked directly at the concubines, but she noticed their eyes, dull, distant, almost empty. Some mornings, she found hairpins on the floor or a tear-stained sleeve hidden beneath the futon. Once, she found a folded note written in trembling ink. "If I do not wake, tell the moon I am free." Chio began to understand that beauty inside these walls was a curse. The more a woman was admired, the shorter her peace became. There were stories of punishments disguised as ceremonies. A concubine who disobeyed might be summoned to a purification ritual. She would be told to bathe alone, to pray, and to drink sacred water. By dawn, she would be gone. The Lord called it cleansing. The servants called it vanishing. The wife of the Lord, elegant and proud, saw everything yet said nothing. Her own status depended on the illusion of control. She despised the concubines but pitied them too. In her private chamber, she prayed that her husband would tire of them quickly. But jealousy has no mercy. When one concubine became pregnant, the lady of the house smiled sweetly, and arranged a tea ceremony the next day. By nightfall, the concubine had fallen ill. The child never lived. Chio saw the power of silent cruelty and swore never to become part of it. She often gazed at the moon from the servants' corridor, wondering if anyone outside those walls knew what truly happened inside. The world admired the samurai for their discipline, their poetry, their sense of honor. No one imagined that beneath their banners of loyalty lay a river of suffering. The samurai were poets of control. They spoke of enlightenment, yet enslaved hearts in the name of duty. They built temples while hiding their sins behind them. The same hands that wrote verses of beauty could draw blood without hesitation. And yet, among them were a few who doubted. Some lords grew weary of endless power. They began to question whether fear was true strength. But the world offered no forgiveness for weakness. A compassionate lord risked rebellion. A gentle master risked mockery. So they too became prisoners, not of others, but of their own masks. As years passed, the concubines aged like fading blossoms. New girls replaced them, their laughter brief before it turned to silence. Those who survived long enough to see the Lord's death were sent to temples as nuns. It was called redemption, but it was merely exile. They shaved their heads and prayed for souls that no longer listened. Chio, now older, left the castle when the Meiji winds began to blow. The world was changing. Guns replaced swords, and the samurai's age was ending. But even in freedom, she could never forget the faces of the women she served. In her dreams, she still walked the silent corridors and heard the echo of footsteps that led nowhere. In the final years of the Edo period, when the old ways of Japan were crumbling like the paint on a forgotten screen, there stood a castle far from the capital. It was called Shirogane-jo, the Silver Castle, though its stones had long since faded to crimson with rust and time. Surrounded by mountains and mist, it watched over a land that no longer believed in war yet could not remember peace. Inside those walls lived Lord Itsunori, a man born to rule an age that was dying. His hair had turned to silver, but his heart clung to the glory of a vanished world. He spoke of honor, loyalty, and bushido, as if words alone could hold back the tide of change. To the peasants who glimpsed him from afar, he was a ghost of history, a figure from a story their children no longer cared to hear. But within the castle, behind the lacquered doors and painted screens, another figure moved in silence, a young woman named Akiko. She was not born to nobility. Her father had been a scholar, her mother a singer in Kyoto. When famine came and debts followed, she was sold to a retainer of the lord. Her beauty was described as quiet, the kind that drew the eye without asking for it. At 17, she entered the Silver Castle as a servant. By 19, she had become the lord's concubine. No one knew how it began. Some said she was chosen for her calm, others that she was offered as a gift by the lady of the house to distract her husband's melancholy. But once the sliding door closed behind her, she ceased to belong to the world outside. Akiko's first night in the castle was one of ritual, not affection. She was bathed in water scented with yuzu flowers, dressed in silk that belonged to the late wife of the lord, and led through corridors lit by paper lanterns. She walked barefoot on tatami that smelled faintly of cedar and age. Every step was measured, every breath controlled. When she entered the lord's chamber, she saw him sitting before an ink painting of a crane. He did not speak, he only gestured for her to kneel. The silence was not cruel, it was ceremonial. In that silence, Akiko realized that the man before her was not seeking love. He sought continuity, a shadow of a time when men like him ruled with certainty and died with pride. He asked her name. Akiko, she whispered. He nodded. The autumn child, he said. You will bring quiet to this house. From that night, she lived not as a woman, but as a presence, a ghost made flesh. Her world was measured by the rhythm of footsteps, the creak of doors, and the sound of the bell that marked the hours. Days blurred into seasons. Spring came and went without blossoms. Autumn arrived without wind. The servants learned quickly that Akiko was unlike the others. She did not gossip, did not weep, did not pray aloud. She moved through the halls as if listening to something no one else could hear. Some whispered she was cursed, others said she had seen death and survived it. Lord Itsunori found comfort in her stillness. She became his mirror, reflecting not his cruelty, but his fatigue. He told her of battles fought when he was young, of comrades long dead, of a world that had honored its warriors. Akiko listened without judgment. Her silence gave him the illusion that his past still mattered. Yet beneath that silence, her thoughts were alive. She watched the world outside shrinking, the peasants speaking of railroads, the merchants whispering of Western guns. She saw the Lord's soldiers drilling with wooden spears, pretending they could face the future with rituals of the past. She pitied them, even as she pitied herself. One night, she found the courage to ask, "My lord, do you fear what is coming?" Itsunori looked at her, his eyes distant. "Fear? No. The world fears me. But the world is changing," she said softly. He smiled. Not kindly, but like a man humoring a child. "The world has always changed, Akiko. And yet men like me remain." That was the lie he told himself, and perhaps the one he needed to believe. Months passed. The castle grew colder. The banners that once fluttered proudly over its gates hung motionless. The retainers who had once served in dozens now numbered only a handful. And still, the Lord held his feasts, small echoes of grandeur, attended by silence and ghosts. Akiko sat beside him at those feasts, her face painted, her posture perfect. She poured sake with the precision of a ceremony and smiled when required. But behind her calm exterior, she began to see the cracks forming, in the walls, in the servants' faces, in the heart of the man who ruled them. He had built his life upon fear, and now fear was all that remained. One stormy evening, a messenger arrived from Edo. The shogunate had fallen, the emperor had taken power. The samurai were to lay down their swords. The Lord read the decree in silence. Then, without a word, he burned it in the brazier beside him. "This castle," he said, "was built by the blood of my ancestors. No emperor, no foreign god, will take it from me." Akiko watched the flames consume the paper, and for the first time, she felt afraid, not of him, but for him. He was a man standing against the tide with a blade that no longer had an edge. In the weeks that followed, the outside world crept closer. Merchants stopped visiting, the roads became empty, even the birds that nested in the watchtowers flew away. Yet within the castle, time stood still. The servants carried on their duties as if the old order still held meaning. The Lord's armor was polished daily, though it would never again see battle. One night, Akiko wandered into the armory. She ran her fingers along the steel helmets, the rusted spears, the swords that had once gleamed in war. They were relics now, heavy, useless symbols of a world buried in pride. She thought of the men who had died for these weapons. She wondered if they, too, had believed their names would last forever. When she turned, she saw Itsunori watching her. His face was unreadable. "Do you mourn them?" he asked. "I don't know," she said. "Perhaps I mourn what they believed in." The Lord approached her slowly. "You are young," he said. "You do not understand that belief is what keeps the soul from rotting. Even when it blinds us?" she asked. He paused. "Especially then." He left without another word. But that night, Akiko heard him walking the corridors long after midnight, muttering prayers to ancestors who could no longer hear. As winter descended, the castle became a world of ice and whispers. The servants lit fires that barely warmed the rooms. The Lord spent hours alone in the shrine, reciting oaths to gods forgotten by time. Akiko stayed near the window, watching snow fall through the moonlight. In that silence, she began to dream of leaving, of crossing the mountains, of finding a life untouched by titles and ghosts. But she knew it was impossible. For a woman like her, the world outside was another kind of prison. One evening, while she folded the Lord's robes, she found a small object hidden among them, a lock of hair tied with a crimson thread. She recognized it at once. It belonged to his late wife. When she looked up, Itsunori was watching her. "She died young," he said. "Too young. I kept that to remember what I failed to protect." Akiko said nothing, she only bowed her head. But when she placed the lock of hair back into the drawer, she felt something shift inside her. A quiet understanding that she, too, would someday become a memory he clung to, another fragment of regret in a house full of ghosts. And as she extinguished the lamp that night, she whispered a prayer, not for herself, but for the castle, for the man who ruled it, and for a world that refused to die even as it decayed. Years passed like ripples in still water. Nothing seemed to move in the silver castle, yet everything was quietly changing. The once proud walls were veiled in ivy. The stone paths cracked beneath moss and time. The banners that had once carried the clan's crest now hung in tatters, their colors drained by the rain. The world beyond those walls had already turned the page. Samurai were relics, merchants ruled the cities, and western coats replaced kimono in the streets. But within the castle, the illusion of the old order persisted. Lord Itsunori still rose before dawn, still bowed before the household shrine, still polished the sword that had not been drawn in 20 years. The servants obeyed out of habit, not loyalty. They knew their stipends had no value now, that the land that once fed them belonged to the new government. Yet they stayed, perhaps out of fear or pity, or because they, too, no longer knew what life outside the castle meant. And through it all, Akiko remained, unchanged in appearance, but deeper in silence. The seasons no longer measured her life, the Lord's moods did. When he was calm, the castle seemed to breathe. When he raged, the air turned heavy as stone. In those long, quiet years, Akiko learned to read the silence between words. A servant's trembling hands. A retainer's averted eyes. The way the Lord lingered before his wife's portrait each morning. Each small gesture was a sentence in a language of decay. Sometimes, at night, she walked the inner courtyard. The pond there had once reflected the moon like glass, but now it was choked with leaves. Frogs no longer sang, only the wind moved across the surface. She would stand by the water and think of the world beyond the walls, the trains that now roared through valleys, the cities that glowed with new lights. She had never seen them, yet she could feel their presence, like the pulse of a world that had forgotten her. She often wondered what would happen when the lord finally died. Would the castle be abandoned? Would she be cast out, left to beg as an old woman no one remembered? Or would she, too, vanish into the earth like the countless women before her, unmarked, unspoken, unnamed? There were moments when she wished for release. Not death, but something quieter, like waking from a dream that had lasted too long. One summer, a new retainer arrived, Kyoto, a man in his 20s, educated in the city, wearing strange clothes and strange confidence. He was the son of one of the lord's former allies and had been sent as an act of respect, though everyone knew it was pity. The new government had stripped Itsunori of land and rank, leaving him with nothing but the castle and his pride. Kyoto brought with him a foreign pistol, a pocket watch, and words that made the old retainers uneasy. He spoke of factories, ships, and electricity, things that sounded like magic to those who had never left the valley. When he bowed before the lord, he said, "The age of the sword is over." Itsunori replied coldly, "The sword ends when men forget what honor means." "Has your world remembered, or merely replaced it?" Their conversations grew tense, yet the young man stayed. Perhaps he pitied the old lord, or perhaps he wanted to see what the past looked like before it vanished entirely. It was Kyoto who began to speak with Akiko, cautiously at first, then with curiosity. He asked her what it was like to live in such a place, untouched by time. She answered simply, "It is like being snow-trapped inside glass. You can see the world, but you cannot feel it." He told her of Tokyo, of the crowds, the music, the lights that burned all night. He described women walking freely in the streets, men debating politics instead of bloodlines. Akiko listened as if he were describing another planet. "Do they still bow to one another?" she asked. "Rarely," he said. "We bow to no one now, only to money." When he left, she stood by the gate and watched him disappear down the misty road. For a moment, she thought she heard the faint sound of train whistles echoing through the valley, distant, haunting, irresistible. The lord noticed the change in her. "You've been listening to him," Itsunori said one evening. "I listen to everyone, my lord," she replied. "Then hear me well. The world outside is poisoned by greed and weakness. Men there have forgotten their ancestors. Here, at least, we remember who we are." "Do we?" she asked softly. He turned sharply toward her, but said nothing more. That night, he did not summon her. The following months were marked by storms. The river overflowed, the outer walls cracked, and several servants fled. The ones who remained whispered that the gods were abandoning the castle. Itsunori ordered the shrine rebuilt, though no priests came to bless it. He began performing the rites himself, kneeling for hours before the altar until his knees bled. Akiko watched in silence, realizing that his faith was no longer devotion, it was desperation. He prayed not to the gods, but to memory itself. Sometimes she heard him muttering to his sword, calling it by name, Kagetsu, the moonlight. He polished it until the steel gleamed like water, then set it beside his bed as if it could guard him from time. In the courtyard, the young retainer Kyoto tried to speak reason. "My lord, the government will confiscate the castle. You must leave before they send soldiers." "This castle is my body," Itsunori answered. "If they take it, they take me. Then they will take both," Kyoto said quietly. Akiko overheard this exchange from the corridor. She wanted to speak, to beg the lord to listen, but she knew it was useless. His pride was a wall thicker than the castle's stone. Days turned into weeks. Kyoto eventually departed, leaving behind a sealed letter for Akiko. Inside, he wrote, "When the gates finally open, walk through them. Do not wait for permission. The world is cruel, but at least it moves." She kept that letter hidden beneath her futon. Every night, she unfolded it and read the words again, tracing them with her fingers until the ink began to fade. Then one night, the inevitable happened. A messenger arrived, not from Edo this time, but from the local governor. The castle was to be dismantled. The land would be repurposed. The samurai age was officially over. When the lord heard this, he laughed, not with humor, but with madness. "They will not take this house from me," he said. "I will turn it to ash before they do." The servants begged him to reconsider, but he ordered barrels of oil brought into the courtyard. Akiko followed him as he walked among the walls, touching each pillar as if saying farewell to an old friend. These stones have heard my ancestors' vows, he murmured. If they fall, so does their honor. My lord, she pleaded, honor is not in the stones. It's in how you leave them. He turned to her with eyes full of sorrow and pride. You are wiser than I wished you to be. That night, Akiko dreamt of fire. The castle stood in flames, and within the blaze she saw faces, women she had known, servants who had vanished, and the Lord himself, standing among them with his sword raised against the burning sky. When she awoke, she found him gone. In his chamber, the oil jars were open. The smell was thick in the air. She ran through the corridors, calling his name. The wind roared through the cracks, carrying the echo of her voice through empty halls. Then, in the great hall, she found him, standing before the ancestral shrine, dressed in full armor. My time ends tonight, he said calmly. The world will not remember me, but I will leave it on my own terms. He raised a torch toward the walls, but she stepped forward, taking it from his hand. No, she whispered, you cannot burn what already belongs to ghosts. For a moment, he looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as a concubine, not as a servant, but as a mirror of his own loneliness. You were always too strong for this place, he said. Had you been born a man, perhaps you would have saved me. Perhaps, she said, but I was born to remember you instead. He smiled faintly, then set the torch down. Then remember this. A samurai dies by his choice, not by decree. He drew his sword and placed it across his knees. The ritual of seppuku was ancient, forbidden now, yet sacred to him. He whispered a final prayer, one last apology to the world he had failed to protect. Akiko knelt beside him. She did not weep. As dawn broke, the first light fell across the blade, and with a slow, deliberate motion, Lord Itsunori ended his life. The castle did not burn that night, but something inside Akiko did. She closed his eyes, cleaned the blade, and placed it beside his body. Then she sat in silence as the sun rose over the valley, turning the snow to gold. Outside, the new world waited, loud, merciless, alive. But inside the silver castle, time finally stopped. When the dawn after his death came, the silver castle stood completely still. Akiko wrapped the lord's body in white linen, placed the sword upon his chest, and bowed until her forehead touched the cold floor. No priest, no retainer, no witness, only her breath and the whisper of the wind through the paper screens. She lit 3 sticks of incense, and the smoke rose like a fragile thread between the living and the dead. Then she walked to the gate. The doors, once guarded by soldiers, opened with a long, aching creak. She stepped outside for the first time in 15 years. The morning air felt sharp, alive, almost foreign. She turned once to look back. The castle's towers glowed faintly red under the sunrise, as if blushing for all they had hidden. The valley below was quiet. Fields once filled with farmers lay empty, replaced by telephone poles and rails of shining steel. A train howled in the distance, a sound like an animal she had never heard before. She flinched, then smiled. The world had moved on. For days she walked without direction. Villagers stared at her silk robes, at the pale woman who carried no luggage and spoke to no one. Some called her mad. Others bowed, thinking she was a wandering nun. She accepted both interpretations. At night she slept beneath shrines or under trees, listening to the wind in the reeds. Sometimes she dreamed of the castle, but each time it was smaller, dimmer, until finally it vanished from her sleep altogether. One evening, she reached a small mountain temple. The monks there took her in without question. She gave her name simply as Akiko, once of the Silver Valley. The abbot nodded, as if he understood more than she said. They gave her a broom, a straw mat, and silence, the only things she truly needed. Seasons passed again. She tended the garden, swept the fallen leaves, and read from the sutras she barely understood. Pilgrims came and went, leaving offerings and prayers. Some asked her to write their wishes on paper. She did so carefully, her calligraphy graceful, the strokes steady, the same hands that had once poured sake for a lord now writing prayers for strangers. She never spoke of her past, yet rumor grew around her. The villagers began to call her the widow of the samurai. Travelers climbed the path just to see the woman who had lived in a castle and chosen silence over wealth. When they asked her why she stayed, she answered, because silence remembers what words destroy. Years turned her hair silver. The world around her became unrecognizable. Children played with toys from the West, soldiers marched with rifles instead of swords, and newspapers carried stories of empires and wars she could no longer imagine. But the mountains remained, and so did she. Sometimes, when the temple bell rang at dusk, she thought of Lord Itsunori. She no longer hated him, nor pitied him. He had been a man born into an impossible age, too proud to live in the new world, too fragile to let the old one die. She wondered if he ever found peace among his ancestors, or if his spirit still wandered the empty halls, searching for a voice that could forgive him. One winter, a young historian visited the temple. He had heard whispers of an old woman who knew the last samurai by name. He bowed deeply and asked, "Is it true, Lady Akiko? Did you witness the end of their age?" She looked at him for a long time before replying, "Yes." And it was not the swords that ended. It was the hearts that carried them. The man begged her to tell her story so that he might record it. She shook her head. The world does not need another tale of men and war. Let it remember the silence that followed instead. When he left, she returned to the garden. Snow had begun to fall, quiet, endless, forgiving. She swept the path until the broom froze in her hands, then sat by the stone lantern to rest. The sound of the wind reminded her of distant waves, though the sea was many miles away. That night she felt her strength fading. She lit one final candle before the statue of Kannon, the goddess of mercy. The flame flickered as she whispered, "I am ready to be forgotten." At dawn, the monks found her seated in prayer, her body still, her face serene. The candle beside her had burned down completely, leaving a pool of wax shaped like a crescent moon. They buried her beneath the plum tree behind the temple. In spring, when the blossoms opened, their petals were pale red, the color of rusted steel and fading memory. Years later, when the temple was restored after another war, workers found a small wooden box buried near the roots of the plum tree. Inside was a single letter, written in delicate ink. To whoever finds this, once there was a castle that believed itself eternal. Once there was a man who could not change, and a woman who learned that silence is stronger than obedience. I was her, or perhaps only her echo. Remember us not for our suffering, but for the stillness that followed it. The letter was signed simply, Akiko. The historian who read it wept. He placed the box in a small museum near the valley where the silver castle had once stood. Nothing remained of the fortress now, only stones scattered among the grass and the faint outline of foundations hidden beneath moss. Tourists passed by without knowing what stories lay beneath their feet. But on quiet nights, when the wind swept through the valley, locals swore they could hear a woman's voice carried through the bamboo, not crying, not pleading, simply singing a tune older than memory. And so the world moved on, as it always does. The castles fell, the swords rusted, the names faded. Yet the last concubine endured, not in history books, not in songs, but in the silence that all things return to.